Are you looking to hone your pattern making skills or even just get started in pattern making yourself? Well, today we're going through the 10 tips I have for beginners in pattern drafting. Hi, I'm Christina and I love to pattern draft, whether it is hand drafting with paper and pencils and curves or it's digital drafting in Adobe Illustrator. I love them both for different reasons. So, if you're looking for those tips to get started or how to really hone your craft in pattern making, this video is for you. So if you enjoy pattern making and that type of stuff, make sure to like and subscribe so you can catch some other fun tips and tricks as well as examples on how to pattern draft. So let's dive into that list. The very first thing that I'm going to talk about is taking accurate measurements. If you're going to be flat patterning, you need to make sure that the measurements that you are working off of are accurate. You're going to want the flexible tape and you're going to want to measure. Now, you might have taken your measurements 2 years ago, and due to time changes and bodies fluctuate, you'll always want to at least double check those important measurements. If they're close, then you can go ahead and use old measurements. But if they are different, make sure you retake those measurements so that you are working with an updated set of measurements. I cannot stress how important it is to get your final product fitting you perfectly to have those measurements. The next thing that is essential is your tools. I always recommend having quality tools. You don't need a ton of them, but it's always good to have what you need. I always recommend a 2-inch ruler, a wide hard shell quilting ruler, and then a French curve and a hip curve. Those are basically what you need, as well as paper and pencils. We'll get into those. But you want to make sure that you have those tools that you love and you can work with well. Now, I did just mention paper. I always recommend having good paper that you like. I know a lot of times you can make do with craft paper that you have around the house. I know people who use newspapers and everything. I am a sucker for the dotty paper. I absolutely love it. It's because I can draw on it, and then when I'm truing up my patterns, I can lay them right on top of each other and I can see through to the bottom pattern to make sure that all my patterns are true. But I do know it is a little bit more expensive to use this dotty paper, but I find it holds up really well when you are trying to trace it off of that onto your fabric. Better than some of the other papers I found. But again, that also depends on how you like to get your paper pattern to your fabric. Next, the fourth one is you want to learn those basic pattern symbols, how to use them, and make sure that you are using them. You want to make sure that you're labeling your grain. You want to make sure you're labeling the different notches so that you know which seams are going to line up. But learning those symbols so that you can definitely understand where you were going with your pattern, or if you're handing your pattern off to somebody else, they can also read it. The fifth one goes hand in hand with those basic symbols, and it's labeling your patterns. So if you are working with your pattern, you want to label it that it's for yourself. You want to label if it's for your front, if it's for your side front, if it's for your back, if it's your sleeve, if it's one of your skirt panels. You want to label it, and you want to label how many pieces you need to cut out of it. Because if you draft a pattern, work really hard, true it up, and then you come back to it a week later and nothing's labeled, nothing's true, you're like, ooh, do you actually remember everything that you swore you were going to remember when you were drafting it? Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. I definitely know that I have forgotten to label a certain piece one way, and then when I came back to it, I was like, what was I thinking when I patterned this piece? It doesn't make any sense. So ensure that you are labeling those patterns so you can figure out what you were thinking when you come back to those patterns. The next thing is I always recommend making a muslin mock-up, especially if this is a brand new intricate pattern that you're going to be making out of super expensive fabric. If you want it to fit perfectly that first time, I always recommend making some sort of mock-up out of muslin or something that's close to what your final fabric will be. That way you can make all those adjustments, make sure that they fit well, and that there's no major issues with the pattern. That initial mock-up will save you tons of time later. As it can be a pain, I do find those muslin mock-ups go together very fast in comparison to the final garment. And I always find it is 100% worth it to get the pattern just right. Moving on to number, I don't remember what number I'm on, maybe 7? So we're going to say it's number 7. You want to practice with some basic pattern making first. I know everybody jumps in and they want to make the biggest, grandest, most crazy dress ever. And as you definitely can do that, you might get frustrated more quickly and get confused more often because you're trying to do something that you've never done before and you haven't nailed down those basic techniques. If you can understand and nail down those basic techniques first, do kind of the boring stuff, it will really help you in the long run to be able to get the grand stuff in the long run. Because, it's like anything, you have to practice some of those basic moves, some of those basic slash and spreads and everything, and understand how all that works to then be able to put multiple different steps together when creating a garment. Number 8, I really hope that's where I'm at, but number 8 is make sure you pay attention to grain line. Grain line can change the look of a garment, and you can mess around with the grain line to get different looks. So it's one of those things that if your pattern has a very particular stripe on it and you're wanting the stripes to go in different angles at every seam, you have to think about, will this mess up the entire outlook or the entire overall look of the garment if the grain is on the bias? If that's so, how are you going to make sure that the garment will still maintain the structural security, the structural base of it that it needs? I also do a lot of flatlining when I'm doing this, because if you're wanting those straight seams to be on bias, the bias will stretch. So it's one thing to think about. Grain lines are fun to play around with, but they are essential to know how to use them. Number 9 is seam allowance. When you're drafting your own patterns, you have to remember that you have to add your own seam allowance in. You're not drafting the seam allowance in as you're drafting. You have to add it on later. If you forget to do this, you're going to sew your garment and all of a sudden it's definitely not going to fit because you have taken probably 2 inches out of your whole garment. So once you have everything trued up, all your patterns happy to and ready to go, you can definitely make sure to add your seam allowances. Most home sewing patterns come with 5/8 inch. You don't have to do that if you don't want. You can add different seam allowances at different areas depending on the area of the garment and your finished product. When I'm making my muslin mock-up a few steps back, I sometimes like to give myself an inch seam allowance at all my straight seams around the body. That way, when I'm fitting it to myself, if I'm vastly off on my measurements, I can quickly go and unpick that seam and let it out 1/4 inch on either side, 1/2 inch total, and refit the garment and know exactly how much I let it out and where I let it out, so that when I'm fixing my pattern, it can quickly be translated back onto my pattern. And the 10th tip I have for anybody who is interested in learning how to pattern is practice. If you want to get good at anything, you have to work at it and you have to practice it. And you sometimes have to make some really not great patterns We all have those in our history. We all have those little piles that are like, oh, this is going to be great. And it's like, it didn't turn out so great. But that's okay, because it is the practice that gets you to where you want to go. It is the practice and the failing forward that will get you building beautiful pieces of wearable art someday. So definitely make sure to get those hours of practice in. If you're interested in learning how to draft in Adobe Illustrator, make sure to check below and grab my key commands and useful charts. That way you can get started drafting in Adobe Illustrator. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you like and subscribe so you can see other tips and tricks for pattern making, as well as some examples on how to pattern in Adobe Illustrator. I look forward to seeing you in some of my other videos. Happy patterning!